Live in Hope. I'm very pleased to be speaking to you this morning. I also apologize if my voice comes across a little raspy. I'm recovering from being sick all week. My name is Nick. I'm a student at Union Theological Seminary over on the Upper West Side, doing a master's in religion over there, and I'm concentrating in social ethics. And I think, the reason I chose social ethics as a concentration is because it brings together two, I think, interests that I've had for just the longest time. I grew up in South Carolina, and growing up as a kid, I think what always drew me to the Bible, to my own study of it, was this intense, I think, theological interest as this ground of meaning in life, but also this intense interest in society and how we live into the world. And so that's also the interpretive frame that I like to use when I approach a text. So let me read to you our passage this morning. It comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Okay. And it says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those who was at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." All right, so I don't know how you think about the passage, but for me, I think this passage has always been one that I've found a little troubling. Because when I read this, there's this tension that arises. There's this, I think, tendency to read, or there's a way you can read this passage where it kind of cuts off any ethical imperative that we may have to act for the marginalized and poor in our society. And that has always been troubling to me. And I think, the word in this passage that especially just you wrestle with is the word always, where it says you will always have the poor with you. And I think that always, it lets us, in a way, remain unchallenged in the social vision of our faith. And I think there's this, ability for this always to leave our faith stunted, comfortable, and mediocre. And I think it also, creates this tension with this larger body of Jesus' work. This Jesus, we know, who is very much concerned with service to the poor, healing those who are sick, lifting up those who are less fortunate in society. And I think, that version of Jesus, I think we see maybe best expressed in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, where Jesus, is in the story in Nazareth. He's returned home, and he's asked for the Isaiah scroll, and he's reading from the 61st chapter of Isaiah. And he reads this passage, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And so when I was, wrestling with this text, when I was preparing this sermon, there's this piece where you're like, what's going on here, Jesus? Are you having second thoughts? Are you sometimes caring for the poor, and sometimes, maybe a little bit more concerned about yourself? And so I think, as we work through this morning, I want us to bear with that tension, hold on to it, take it with us a little bit of the way before we relieve that. And so transitioning from there, we're going to move to a little bit more of this text. I want to just highlight, one of the ways I like to approach reading texts as well as reading, you could say people, approach people, is this, we call it hermeneutics, is the big, fun theological term. Hermeneutics is a way of reading, interpreting passages, texts, some might say people, and I like to use what I would call a hermeneutics of compassion, meaning that I try to be gracious as we read the human beings in these texts, recognizing that these were real people with real, things at stake in these stories. And I think this is very helpful when reading oppressed groups in passages and what they're going through. I think it's also very helpful when reading what we would call the villains of the story. And I think this story, of course, has, one of the maybe more villainous characters in Christian history in some renderings, Judas. And, Judas usually gets a bad rap in this passage. I mean, obviously the gospel writer had his own opinions about this. He was a thief, it says it very explicitly in the margins. But I also want us to maybe challenge that reading of Judas. I think that, when we think about who was writing this, these were people who experienced these stories, probably experienced pain as well as a result of Judas's actions. And so I think, there may have been some prejudice involved. But I think, Judas, like any of us, is just a human being filled with vice and virtue. And so there's that complexity there. And I think in my reading of Judas, there is this sincerity present. Judas is sincere in his belief. I think he wouldn't be following Jesus for this amount of time if there wasn't a sincerity there. But I think he's also very likely very misguided in how he goes about things. But I think we could argue that many of the disciples themselves were misguided in how they approached things. But I think that's also just a very human quality, and I don't think we should fault them at that level. Then I also think that in this passage, Judas is making this very fair point in bringing up the wealth and what could be done with it. There is a side to this, this is a yearly wages worth of precious perfume that could be used for the poor. And on that level, I am a little inclined to agree with Judas. And yet, in the story, Jesus doesn't, side with Judas. He ends up coming out on the side of Mary. And so I want to also, highlight the tension there that exists between Jesus siding with Mary and this, I think, rightful claim of Judas. And I want to, excavate that. Because I think Mary also performs this truly beautiful act. And so now this is going to be a little bit of a break, maybe from the norm, but I'm going to propose a question that I think I'd like for us to discuss for 3 or 4 minutes. Just talk amongst ourselves, then we'll come back together and I'll ask for maybe a few people to respond and just, provide their insights. And so this question that I'm offering is, what propels you to do an action? What is it in life you think that underlies the things you choose to do? Like, what are different motivating factors is another way of putting that. All right, so I'll let everyone discuss that for about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, money, sadness, discomfort, fear, yes. Hunger. Yes. Compassion and guilt. Okay. Yeah. Say again? Realizing potential. Okay. Hope. Yeah. Yeah. Good. We got a maybe a wider spread than we did earlier this morning. But yeah, I think a lot of those, some of those are the more, positive, motivating factors. I know for me, I think beauty can also be a great one. I remember, one time I was living in South Korea, but I took a vacation to Japan, and I decided to go hiking in these mountains, and so I took several trains and a bus up to a mountain range, and hike in, spend the night sleeping in this field basically, and then the next day just hiking several different mountain peaks. And I remember one time I was hiking up one of these mountains, and it was just this low overhanging trees that I'm like ducking under trying to get up there. And I sat down to just, gaze out at the surroundings, also because I was very tired by this point. But there's just this profound, beauty that almost like propels you to just be still. Watching the clouds roll over these peaks, it was this just profoundly beautiful, wonderful experience. But I think, like was highlighted, there's also some motivating factors that can be maybe negative and can lead to some negative things. I think like hatred for other people, I think, has motivated countless, atrocities throughout human history. And I think that's something we have to, wrestle with, keep in mind. Greed and pride have also led, to just, the disenfranchisement of many people, and, this development of these senses of egos and self-aggrandizement that, has just been very harmful throughout human history. That has led to, such horrors as the human trafficking across the Atlantic, or, the rise of racist fascism in 1930s Germany, or the imprisonment of, Japanese Americans in concentration camps, or greed-fueled wars in the Middle East, right? Like, these are some of the more negative motivating factors that we have to wrestle with and deal with, especially as Christians, I think. And I think even maybe some of the more, you would say maybe positive things we have in mind, good motivating factors such as like ideas of progress or improving the world have also led to some very negative outcomes. I think of the early 20th century, belief in scientific progress that led to things such as eugenics and the forcible sterilization of human beings, human experimentation, that also in the name of these ideals. And so I think this is where we need to, return to the text and ask, what did Mary know? What did Mary understand here? What has she captured that Jesus is recognizing that even his followers might have missed? And, I think by no means did she maybe get the complete picture, but I think, what she has understood is this love ethic that's sitting at the heart of Jesus' teachings. I think that's what Jesus calls us to allow to propel us, is this love ethic, this most fundamental, essential thing from which we must learn to act. And I think that even like when we are propelled by this love ethic, I would say that really is what then fuels all these other, what we might call virtues, or, motivating factors, hope, beauty. I think, those just gain a different level of meaning when they're infused with this love ethic that Jesus is trying to teach us. And, I think that ethic is captured in things such as, love your neighbor as yourself, or, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. And I also, want to once again return to that. I don't think Jesus is by any means saying to forget the poor here. I think if just have in mind that Jesus himself was a poor man, grew up in poverty, that, that is why his family, when they went to the temple to dedicate him, brought, doves. It's because those were the animals for sacrifice that the poor brought, born in a manger. Yeah, and then also all the folks that he associated with were mostly poor. And, he called his disciples to this mission of poverty as well. And so that's the context in which, they're living, and that's Jesus is living. And so I think I want to then, draw out like maybe the difference here between Mary and Judas. And I think what Judas is getting at is a question of ends. What is the ends that we're seeking here? And, for Judas, I think the ends could be said to be good, care for the poor. But I think, what Mary has understood is that, it's also the means that matter. And means and ends are linked. You can't have unjust means lead to just ends. That was one of the core teachings of, the great Hindu prophet of nonviolence, Mohandas K. Gandhi. And, that's what Dr. King also drew upon, was this, this Gandhian nonviolence. And then, Dr. King put that in a Christian idiom, hate produces more hate. And, to quote Dr. King, he said, along the way of life, someone must have sense enough and morality enough to cut off the chain of hate. This can only be done by those projecting the ethics of love to the center of our lives. And I also would like to emphasize that I think that the move from Mary to Judas is more dynamic than choosing either option alone. See, I think concern for the poor is good, but I think concern for the poor, actions for the poor can also be driven by things such as greed, pride, this self-aggrandizing spirit, will to power, these things that, really just are, mark a spiritual decay. And I think also, there's this danger of maybe having the spirit of love of Mary without the action that just leaves us with this, fundamentally dead ideal. And so I would like to say that you need both parts, and you actually take that love ethic of Mary and move through that to Judas. And I think that also serves as this, immense creative ground from which you can act. So I would like to give you another quote. This one is from a Baptist minister named Walter Rauschenbusch, very prominent in the late 19th century, early 20th century social gospel movement. He ended up teaching up in Rochester, New York, eventually, but he used to be a pastor here in the city. And in 1907, he released this book that became a classic called Christianity and the Social Crisis. And, he offers a brief little reflection on this story that we're talking about this morning that says, he says this: the instinct of love had been a truer guide of conduct than all machine rules of charity. And so I think it's this instinct of love that Jesus recognized in Mary as this beginning of this life of Mary living into this love that Jesus calls us to. And, I think Jesus calls us to this love as this layer that's at the depth of human living that makes life richer, fuller, more vibrant. To use a philosophical word that I'm fond of, love becomes this ontological category, this thing that is woven into the fabric of reality itself. That is able to flow into all these different, areas of our lives. And I in that book, Christianity, the Social Crisis, I own a copy of it, the 100th anniversary tradition, and a professor that I've had the opportunity to study with in school, Dr. Cornel West, comments on Rauschenbusch and his concern for, the crisis of his own day, the crisis of poverty and oppression during the early 20th century of America. He says, Rauschenbusch felt our same urgency and wrestled with our own despair. And he responded with a deep sense of hope, a hope based on our commitment to justice for all, service to others, and a love that counters unlovely persons and circumstances. And this is an essay from 2007, which right about now feels maybe 3 or 4 lifetimes ago. Maybe, I know for me, I would have been in 2nd or 3rd grade at the time, so hadn't quite maybe gotten to the Pastor Todd level of beard growth yet. But I think, this urgency is even more, and this despair is maybe even more potent now, as we contemplate, like, how do we live into the world? How do we live into this love ethic, given our times, our own society? And I would say that the crucial part is letting this love ethic drive us towards justice, because I think that is, this power of love is deeply concerned with justice. And so in school, I also have had the opportunity to study with the brilliant Dr. Dorian, and he wrote an introduction to this book called The Children of Light and Children of Darkness by this 20th century theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr. And in that introduction, he says this: "Love is not merely the content of an impossible ethical ideal, it is the motive force of the struggle for justice." And another theologian I really like says this: "The creative element in justice is love." And so I will reiterate, I think Judas had a proper concern, but I think it matters how you get to that concern. And I think Judas went about it wrong. He was raising this concern of charity, but from the wrong place. And I think, that's why Jesus pushes back against him, because Jesus has been serving the poor. That was what he was concerned with. And so Judas is kind of missing the point. He's being a little pharisaical, maybe. And that's why Jesus is like, no, you go to where Mary is first. You learn this level of love, because that level of love is this, opening to creative possibility. And love becomes this immensely creative force from which you are able to act and imagine new possibilities. And, okay, so then Jesus' statement, "You will always have the poor with me," I also want us to quickly think about maybe where he's drawing upon for that statement. And that statement, "You will always have the poor with you," bears many similarities to a passage in Deuteronomy, actually. Deuteronomy 15:11, which says, Since there will never cease to be someone in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hands to the poor and needy neighbor in your land." And so this verse here is sitting within this chapter in Deuteronomy that is concerned with, ethical conduct around the 7th-year Sabbaths, which were the years when basically all debts were forgiven and, those who were enslaved were set free. And so I think, Jesus, in making that reference, is also drawing us to these passages, and I think that also makes sense in the context of Luke 4:18 and 19, quoting Isaiah, which is concerned with, the year of Jubilee, which is also this, returning of land to those who had maybe lost it over the generations. And so I think this pushes us beyond what Judas is concerned about, which is just this charity, into this maybe deeper, even structural question about how do we live into the world? How do we do justice at this more systemic level? And I think we also need to ask questions about not just the economically poor, but also those who are socially poor and politically poor. I think especially in our own times, love propels us to do more than just pray for the immigrant. I think it also may push us to harbor those who are under threat or targets of human evil. There's this, there's a lot of, right now going around, ICE targeting a lot of students who have been involved with protests and activism. And I think, thinking about how do we push back against that oppression and those crackdowns on human rights and human beings and the suffering that's being inflicted, I think, are important ethical questions that must be asked. I think also asking questions about, how do we stand up against, militarism and, wars that lead to genocide and countless deaths. And I think, I think it also means how do you, I'm going to attempt this word that I failed maybe 4 or 5 times during the first service. How do you accompany people, show up in radical accompaniment? Oh, failed it again. All right, there we go. But you get what I'm saying. This, this going alongside someone. How do you show up for those who are targets? Queer folk, trans folk. I think those are important ethical questions we have to ask if this is, a love ethic that Jesus calls us to. Because I think, this love ethic becomes a fount upon which we can draw. This fount, that isn't some broken cistern, but a well that, plumbs the depths of our soul and that allows us to stand undaunted and firmly planted in a torrential flow that sweeps us. And, as I move to close, despite, I think, this flourish of courage and hope, I expect that even Jesus, in these moments, had been facing this mounting despair. He could see what was coming for him. And, I think in this small moment, I think Mary offered him something that may have been essential to help carry him just a little bit further on his way. Obviously, we're in the season of Lent, and so we're approaching the Good Friday crucifixion, resurrection stories. But I think, Mary in this act of love just offered Jesus a little bit of encouragement. And I think that teaches us the importance of community in wrestling with our own despair and in getting through these troubled times. We have to be the support for one another when institutions and laws maybe are not enough. And I think that's what happens. That's the community becomes what you hold on to when living in the context of empire. That's what Jesus had, and I think that's what we have to rely upon too. And just in closing, I would like to read to you just, the final paragraph from this book here. It's called Jesus and the Disinherited. And this is a wonderful book. I recommend it to everyone here, written by the great Howard Thurman. This is a book that, stories go that Martin Luther King Jr. carried around with him wherever he went. And so we'll close with this. What then is the word of the religion of Jesus to those who stand with their backs against the wall? There must be the clearest possible understanding of the anatomy of the issues facing them. They must recognize fear, deception, hatred, each for what it is. Once having done this, they must learn how to destroy these or to render themselves immune to their domination. In so great an undertaking, it will become increasingly clear that the contradictions of life are not ultimate. The disinherited will know for themselves that there is a spirit at work in life in the hearts of men, which is committed to overcoming the world. It is universal, knowing no age, no race, no culture, and no condition of men. For the privileged and underprivileged alike, if the individual puts at the disposal of the Spirit the needful dedication and discipline, he can live effectively in the chaos of the present, the high destiny of a son of God. Thank you.